Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and a very warm welcome to our webinar about the new investment environment and personal tax landscape in 2024. So, over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to be looking at the landscape for taxpayers in 2024, including fiscal drag, as more and more taxpayers are being dragged into paying tax at a higher marginal rate as a result of frozen tax allowances. We'll be looking at potential inheritance tax changes and also changes to the non-dom regime should a Labour government materialise. We'll also be answering the question as to whether or not taxpayers will be better or worse off. For investors, the markets are behaving differently to what we've been used to over the past decade. So now it's more important than ever to ensure you've got a well managed, diversified portfolio in line with your objectives whilst embracing the new investment environment. So we have a couple of quick introductions before we get going. I'm joined today by Mashud Rahman, who is Head of Investments at Francis Clark Financial Planning, and he'll be discussing his thoughts on how investors need to rethink their approach to investments and think harder on how to capture returns along with the performance of different assets we invest in. As for me, I'm Faye Howard. I'm a partner at PKF Francis Clark, and I lead the private client team of around 60 specialists. And I'm going to be kicking off the webinar today with my views on how the recent economic activities will affect our pockets from a tax perspective in 2024 and beyond. So I'm certainly no economist, but I do very much enjoy working in tax. So I thought I would start this presentation with a brief look at what we've taxed in the past. And whilst looking, I came up with a couple of taxes on wool and on wine. I thought it was really interesting to see how far back the history of taxing things we need went, although it's arguable that we need one of these things rather more than the other, and I'll let you decide which that is. You may recall that in November's autumn statement, it was very much badged as supporting workers and supporting a benefits system which allows people to get back to work. And again, looking back in time, in 1572, we can see the poor law tax was introduced. So we can see here we have a history of providing support for those that need it. The final thing I came across was the 1628 Petition of Right, which Parliament passed to stop the Crown imposing arbitrary taxes on its subjects without consultation. And I have to say, that did make me smile. Coming back up to date today, though, tax today is used essentially for two reasons: to raise revenue or to modify behaviour. So the economic landscape today, it's shifting, and taxes, of course, sit within that. In 2023, the headline was very much that of inflation. Believe it or not, households were better off in 2023, as at that point, the returns on savings outweighed increasing living costs on the whole. Fast forward to 2024, however, and it's estimated that around 1.5 million fixed rate mortgages deals are likely to come to an end. So that's going to change. The result of this is going to be that homeowners who own their homes outright are likely to see an increase in their living standards. And the Institute of Fiscal Studies estimates that that's an increase of around 2%. Those with mortgages, on the other hand, are likely to see a decrease in their standard of living of around 1%, because average monthly mortgage costs, sorry, average annual mortgage costs are set to increase to around about £1,800 a year. And then in between the owners and the mortgages, we have the renters, and they're likely to fall somewhere in between the two. The net effect of all of this, therefore, is that the positive effect of interest rates in 2023 is very likely to reverse in 2024. So, are tax cuts the answer? And when is a tax cut not a tax cut at all? Well, in the autumn statement, we were told about the national insurance cut, which took effect this month. The effect of this is that employees who earn over £50,270, which is the high rate tax threshold, are now £754 a year better off, and employees on an average salary of £35,000 are £448 a year better off. So, yes, this is a cut. However, the effect of this is more than erased by the effects of fiscal drag. And these next few slides demonstrate how this works in reality. So, what is fiscal drag? Well, essentially, it's what happens when earnings and the cost of living rise, but tax allowances and thresholds just don't keep pace with that. In these examples that I'm going to go through with you today, I've assumed that earnings and the cost of living increase at 5% a year, but the tax allowances and thresholds remain frozen, which is what's been previously announced, as personal allowance and basic rate, high rate tax threshold have been frozen since 21-22 and will remain so through to 2027-28. So this example here is for an average earner who's a basic rate taxpayer. So you can see that in 21-22, those earnings of £30,000 would have attracted an effective tax rate of 11.6%. And that's calculated by saying that £17,430 of those earnings will be taxed at 20%. So as a portion of the 30,000 overall earnings, that's an effective rate of 11.6%. That rate increases to 12.4% in the current 23-24 tax year. And by the time we get to 27-28, it's increased to 13.7%. So in real terms, the amount of tax paid has increased from £3,486 to £5,527. So that tax burden is 58.5% higher in 27-28 than it was in 21-22. Now, our tax system is full of cliff edges, and where the effective fiscal drag is greatest is where it pushes taxpayers from one band into another. So in this slide here, we look at what happens for a higher earner who is just tipping over the £100,000 threshold where the personal allowance is tapered. And that tapering kicks in at £100,000, at which point the personal allowance is reduced by £1 for every £2 the taxpayer's income exceeds £100,000. So again, assuming that pay and inflation rise by 5% per annum, this individual starts off in 2021 with a full personal allowance, which is gradually tapered. And by the time we get to 27-28, it's been completely eroded. So what this means in effective rates of tax is that the rate has increased from 26.8% in 21-22 to 28.9% in 23-24 and 34.2% in 27-28. So in this scenario, the effective fiscal drag has been to increase the tax paid from £25,432 to £43,492, which is a huge increase of 71%. The other cliff edge where this kind of thing happens is where we tip from the basic rate threshold into the higher rate band, which is currently at £50,270 of earnings. Again, based on the same assumptions, we can see that this taxpayer has tipped over the high rate threshold in 2022-23, such that the effective rate of tax has increased from 15% in 21-22 to 21.2% in 27-28, which is a 90.1% increase in the tax due of £7,486 in 21-22 to £14,234 in 27-28. But we're not stopping there. So at the same kind of level, if we take this one step further, £50,000 is also the threshold where the child benefit starts to be tapered, and this is tapered away fully by the time the earner gets to £60,000. This example here assumes one child for which child benefit is claimed. And as you can see, the clawback of child benefit increases the effective rate of tax paid from the 15% we've seen previously in 21-22 to 23.2% in 27-28. So in cash terms, the amount of tax paid has increased from £7,486 to £15,565, which is a whopping 107.9% increase. But remember, this individual standard of living is the same in 27-28 as in 21-22, because earnings have kept up with the cost of living and the amount of tax has doubled, but the personal allowance and the tax thresholds have been frozen. So I just thought it would be interesting to see what would happen if the allowances and rates were also inflated. So we've got a basic rate taxpayer here. And what this slide shows is that in order to collect the same amount of tax that would be collected by 27-28, if the personal allowance and the high rate threshold were moved in line with inflation, a basic rate tax of 23.7% would be required by 27-28. And whilst an increase to the basic rate of tax would be met with outcry, this is effectively what's happening each year. But instead of increasing the rate of tax, the Chancellor's freezing allowances. So he's achieving the same aim of getting to an effective basic rate of tax of 23.7% by 27-28 by stealth. Now, we've seen that taxes are rising, but recent announcements are all about tax cuts. However, the problem with this is that tax cuts tend to drive inflation. Inflation leads to interest rate rises, and then the real concern, particularly with housing costs as they are, is that we tend to end up in a recession. An IFS article recently stated that we are in a horrible fiscal bind. Taxes are currently approaching their highest ever level. Public spending plans are unrealistically tight, and tax cuts, of course, have to be funded. Now, the NHS is beyond creaking. State pension increases have been promises and need to be paid. And the uncertain political situation worldwide means that leaving the UK exposed on defence spending is not an option. So, whilst we might be hoping for cuts, it's becoming increasingly obvious that the scope for cuts in any meaningful way is extremely limited. Cuts, nevertheless, are being mooted. So I just wanted to look at what has been sort of speculated about, and probably one of the main topics that's come up is inheritance tax. Inheritance tax is a vastly unpopular tax, and I completely understand why. It's very much seen as a tax on taxed income, and actually, it doesn't raise that much money. But perhaps the most surprising thing is it really doesn't affect that many people. Abolishing it would cost around about £7 billion in today's terms. We think it's quite unlikely to be abolished, but certainly some simplification would be welcome. The IFS estimated that abolishing IHT would mean almost half the benefit would go to estates worth £2.1 million or more. 90% of estates would be unaffected. So, could the nil rate band be increased to £500,000? Many years ago now, the Conservatives actually talked about raising the IHT threshold to 500,000, and in 2017 they sort of announced that they had done this because this is when the residence nil rate band was introduced. So everybody gets the basic nil rate band of £325,000, but if when you die you have a residence in your estate which you leave to direct descendants, and your estate is not over £2 million, then you will get the full residence nil rate band of 175,000. So the 325 plus the 175 gives you the 500. But it's really complicated, and actually it's really quite unfair because it's not available to those with the largest estates, and of course it's not available to those without children. Other reliefs that are particularly generous in the IHT area are agricultural property relief and business property relief. However, whilst they're generous, they also provide an incredibly important function in that they allow genuine businesses to be passed on to the next generation. Essentially, if you have a farming business or a trading business, they can be passed to the next generation tax-free. And pensions are a great way of IHT planning as well, because anything you put into the right kind of pension is outside of your estate for IHT. And of course, they attract some very attractive income tax relief when you make contributions into them. So is it time to amend, remove, or cap some or all of these reliefs? According to the Institute of Fiscal Studies, cutting the main rate of inheritance tax from 40% to 25% and increasing the nil rate band to 525,000, getting rid of the residence nil rate band, could be funded by capping agricultural property relief, business property relief, and bringing pensions within the IHT estate. Now, there's some pluses and minuses of that, but perhaps a simpler way to sort of increase the tax take would be to look at something like removing the capital gains tax uplift on death that happens where assets qualify for agricultural property relief or business property relief. There it does seem to be a logic in that, because essentially it does almost seem too generous that when somebody dies, if their estate consists of all agricultural property or trading business property, and that those assets can be passed on to their children or whoever they wish, free of inheritance tax. But in addition to that, they will be uplifted to the current market value for capital gains tax purposes. So if a business and a farm, say, were passed to a child, they could be sold very soon after they take an ownership via inheritance with no tax payable. So potentially looking at removing that capital gains tax uplift it's something that's been spoken about, and it's something that, whilst we really wouldn't want to see it happening, it does make quite a lot of sense. Um, In terms of the percentage of estates paying IHT, it's I due to the job that we do, we see a lot of people with IHT queries. So when I first sort of heard this many years ago, how few estates were affected by IHT, I was actually quite surprised. But I really like this graph because you can sort of see what's happened to the economy in general. You can see where the 2008 financial crash hit, and also where the residence nil rate band was introduced in 2017. The black line on that graph shows that around 4% of estates were affected by IHT in 2020-21. And because of expected increases to the general level of wealth of the population, the Institute of Fiscal Studies are expecting to see this increase to 7% by 2032-33. And following on from this next graph follows the same profile, and it shows the amount of IHT paid. What we've got here is a graph that shows that actually in 2020-21, these graphs are all sort of 2 years behind. It shows that just under £6 billion of IHT was paid. Currently, that figure is around about 7 billion, and it's set to increase to about 15 billion by 32-33. So it's becoming an increasingly important tax. And this next graph is a heat map. It's a heat map by constituency, which shows where the biggest attractors of IHT in terms of estates can be found. It's probably no surprise there that you can see London has a number of estates that will attract IHT, but actually there's significant exposure in the south and towards the southwest. So I guess the moral of the story here is, do come and talk to us and see what we can do for you in terms of inheritance tax planning. So other suggestions. A 2% cut to the basic rate of 20% has been mentioned, but this on its own seems quite unrealistic, as it's going to have to be funded from spending cuts, and it's difficult to see that this is sustainable in the longer term. And by difficult, I mean pretty much impossible, particularly when we've seen, as demonstrated earlier, the increasing tax receipts the Chancellor is expecting to see as a result of fiscal drag. The high income child benefit charge is an interesting one too, as this is a really unfair system, and the Prime Minister's even has admitted this publicly. And it's really unfair because in a family where there are two earners on £50,000, they would be significantly better off than a family where there's one earner on £100,000. Now, the gross household income is the same, but the single earner household is worse off to the tune of around £9,700 a year, as part of their earnings fall into the higher rate tax threshold. In fact, quite a lot of them do. Whereas in the dual earner household, both are basic rate taxpayers. When you add into this the fact that the dual earner household gets to keep all of their child benefit and the single earner household loses it, this disparity rises to around £11,000. So doing something with that child benefit threshold is likely to go some way to addressing this. But because that tapering threshold, which kicks in at £50,000, is so closely aligned with the higher rate tax threshold, realistically, the higher rate threshold would also need to move. So it'll be interesting to see if we do see any unfreezing of the tax bands, which would temper some of the effect of fiscal drag that I spoke about earlier. And the final point to talk about here isn't so much a cut, and it's not so much a suggestion as an action, as we have seen a real push from HMRC recently to move people away from helplines where they speak to actual real people and towards self-serve digital options. Now, last summer, we saw a 3 month closure of helplines with only 4 days' notice given, and there was an announcement that helplines will be cut by 30% by the end of 2024 to allow HMRC to reallocate their staff to other areas within the business. So, in many ways, this is certainly a cut. And whilst it would be really good to see some of the ridiculous timescales HMRC are currently working to reduced, it is preventing access to help with queries to a large segment of the population. And our agent lines are also affected. So, dealing with tax is getting more challenging all round. So, that's what the blue corner are suggesting. What are we looking at from the red corner? Well, VAT on school fees is the area where there has been a huge amount of noise, and understandably so. To levy VAT on school fees, a legislation change will be required as education supplies are currently exempt. Our VAT team have done quite a lot of looking into this and writing because, understandably, it affects a lot of our clients. However, it might not be as straightforward as 20% on the current costs, as supplies will consist of more than one element. They'll include things such as food and drink, travel on school trips, which are not typically chargeable at 20%. And there's also likely to be some level of VAT reclaim, and that could potentially be significant. So, could advance payments help with this? Quite possibly, but possibly not. But the key thing is that it involves some risk. The problem with it is that the school must have unfettered access to those funds. So if you pay your fees in advance and the school runs out of money and becomes insolvent or closes, that money's gone. HMRC might also view prepayment as abusive and want to assess VAT on prepaid fees. We also might see some sort of anti avoidance legislation. However, when we do see anti avoidance legislation, typically it is not retrospective. So, parents with sufficient funds may therefore wish to pay fees in advance. However, if VAT is levied on school fees, it is unlikely to be that net increase of 20%. It's possibly not so bad as it sounds, but it obviously it's not popular and it's still going to hurt. But do definitely check any school fee contracts if you are looking to prepay school fees, just to make sure that there is no mechanism for claiming back VAT from you at a later date. The other area where we hear a lot of noise is about non-DOMs. So non-DOMs are typically people born abroad who've made the UK their temporary home, possibly for quite a long time, but they do have the intention of leaving it at some point in the future. One of the main benefits of being a non-dom is that they can use a remittance basis of tax, such that any foreign income or gains are only taxed in the UK to the extent that they're remitted here. So this allows wealth to build up overseas in a lower tax environment outside of the UK tax net. Now, for the first few years, there is no charge for using the remittance basis, not until the user has been UK resident for 7 of the last 9 tax years. And at this point, to continue using that basis costs £30,000 a year. This increases to £60,000 once the individual has been UK resident for 12 of the last 14 tax years. And in return for using that remittance basis, you lose your personal allowance and capital gains tax annual exemption, but you only pay tax on remitted income and gains. So that's a very, very small price to pay in the scheme of things. Another benefit is that for the first 15 out of 20 tax years of being UK resident, no non-UK assets are taken into account for inheritance tax. So it's quite a beneficial regime for people who by accident have been born abroad. They come to the UK, they make it their home, they benefit from all the great things the UK has to offer, but actually the tax that we get from them isn't as much as it would be had they not been non-domiciled. And initially, the suggestions were that Labour wanted to abolish the non-dom regime, but they're watering that down now and backtracking to the point where they're looking at reform rather than abolition. The respected law firm Withers released a report recently just with some suggested reforms, which made for some quite interesting reading. What Withers are suggesting is that actually this regime should be open to any individual who hasn't lived in the UK for the last 10 years. So, regardless of whether you were born here or not, you would be able to use this regime should Withers' suggestions be adopted. What they're also suggesting is that there is a flat annual fee for the use of this basis. And to put this into context, Italy charges €100,000 a year for the use of their remittance basis, and Jersey charges £250,000 a year plus 1% on income over 1.25 million. So at the moment, looking at the charges that we levy, we aren't competitive in a good way for somebody in the non-dom regime, but there is potentially scope to make this a little bit more fair and more competitive and in line with other countries. Withers are also suggesting that there is a clear cut-off point. Some other countries offer this basis indefinitely, others cap it typically at 15 years. The suggestion for Withers is that it is capped for a set period. And of course, there would also need to be some sort of transitional arrangements to prevent an exodus of talent benefiting from the current non-dom regime. So it will be interesting to see whether anything there is actually adopted by Labour should they come into power. The other thing that there's been a lot of talk about is inheritance tax reliefs. And Labour have specifically said, we have no intention of changing APR, which is agricultural property relief. Now, currently, this relief is worth about £1 billion, so very much small fry in the scheme of things. What they haven't said is, what about business property relief? And just going back to the point I made earlier about the capital gains tax uplift, potentially you could leave APR alone because that's an inheritance tax relief, but actually what you could do is remove that capital gains tax rebasing so that when an asset is later sold, more capital gains tax is collected on it, and they haven't said anything about that. In fact, it's been very quiet on capital gains tax in general, so it will be quite interesting to see whether we hear anything along those lines in March. So, in conclusion, um, according to the Institute of Fiscal Studies, the post-election Chancellor's economic and fiscal inheritance will be miserable, and that was published in an article in the Telegraph this morning. And from what we've seen so far, clearly that is very much the case. Tax may be cut in the short term to win votes, but in the current economy, tax cuts are unsustainable long term. What the Chancellor did have is the benefit of a bit of an unexpected dip in inflation at the end of 2023, which has given him a little bit of headroom. However, what this will mean is that tax receipts will be reduced, and that very much stymies his ability to do too much with that headroom. So, to answer the question that we asked at the beginning of the webinar, unsurprisingly, the economic outlook for 2024 is quite uncertain, but unfortunately, in real terms, we are likely to be poorer. So that's my bit on sort of tax. I'm now going to hand over to Mash to talk about the investment outlook.
It's great. Thank you, Faye. Some really interesting points there. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mashud, Head of Investments here at Francis Clark, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the investment environment we find ourselves in today. So I would say the following are probably the 5 big headlines I think of when talking about private client investment portfolios. The primary focus is inflation. Data is showing us that inflation is coming down. However, what markets want to see is inflation continuing to drop towards the target of 2%. Today, the uncertainty lies in this point. For example, last week we saw that in the UK, our inflation figures went up slightly for the month of December to 4%. So UK markets are really continuing to keep a close eye on the January data to see if December was just from a little bit too much Christmas shopping or whether there is more at play here. Inflation is the key focus from all areas of the market because until the inflation is properly under control, we can't realistically expect interest rates to start coming down. Markets are currently priced in for interest rates to start coming down. For example, in the US, where we've recently seen markets rally quite strong, particularly in the last couple of weeks. The stock markets there are currently priced in for 6 rate cuts over the next sort of 12 to 18 months, with the first one being in March. So quite an optimistic outlook, and we'll continue to keep a close eye on the situations there. Something that I think is really important is, particularly in the short term, for some investors, achieving a positive real return or a return that's higher than inflation might not be possible to do whilst remaining in some people's risk profiles. And this doesn't mean that your returns are poor, but rather we just need to remind ourselves that inflation is currently really high. And that's okay to not outperform inflation over a 12-month period. But rather, what we need to do is keep focused on the longer term objectives. In the last market cycle, it was far simpler for investment managers to achieve returns above inflation. Taking more risk typically resulted in more returns, and having record low interest rates and really stable and low inflation figures were really large contributors to this. Now, whereas in a new cycle with higher interest rates and higher inflation, investors are required to think much harder on how they're going to capture returns within investment markets. Gone are the days, I think, where you could simply invest into markets with any given risk level and expect really strong returns within your portfolio. I think investors need to think of more clever ways, more sophisticated approaches to try and capture returns above what is being made available to us in savings accounts, for example. This debate around investing versus saving is clearly present and valid, actually. And for some people, perhaps those with particularly short time horizons or those who are very risk averse and really don't like seeing any short-term volatility and would actually rather just end up keeping cash under the mattress, uh, these savings accounts are valid options to you, and certainly much more appealing than they were a few years ago. However, in general, we remain confident that investing into markets over the long term holds a greater return outlook than saving in the bank. Okay, so now I want to talk about is what's being referred to as the new normal, and it's the phrase "new" that I want to touch on here. Inflation and central bank rates have historically actually averaged around 2%. Inflation has always had a target of 2%. So actually, what I think we need to ask ourselves, is it new, or do we just need to go back to being comfortable with those levels? It will of course take time for us as consumers and investors to get used to not having rates at these record low levels. However, given that we've been able to make it through all the challenges over the past few years, I think that we can remain comfortably positive about the years ahead. Markets have been volatile recently, particularly over the past few years, and as we go into more challenging times from an investing and economic perspective, I think what will be crucial for investors to focus on is maintaining a multi-asset portfolio and having a genuinely well diversified approach. I'll be touching on this in a little bit more detail shortly. Being in such challenging times from an investment perspective may not be the most attractive prospect at the moment. However, we can use it as a good opportunity to make sure that we are genuinely focusing on long term objectives. At the end of the day, if your investments are significantly below inflation this year, this doesn't matter too much as long as you're comfortably on track to meet your long term goals. And that's the most important thing. I think we also need to perhaps think slightly different on longer term returns. The past market cycle, particularly leading up to 2021 and the early part of 22, in some people, this installed almost a false sense of confidence on returns. And we need to remind ourselves that over the next 10 years or the next market cycle, it's likely to be very different to what we experienced in the last one. And achieving almost double-digit returns with ease may not be as normal as what we have perhaps gotten used to. This table here is called a patchwork quilt, and actually it's one of my favorite visuals within the industry. What it shows us is the average return from different asset classes over the last 10 calendar years. And what it shows to me is two things. Firstly, and I'd say the most important thing, is the inconsistency of the rankings. We see all of the different asset classes achieving different returns over the time period, which to me implies that you would want a good mix of asset classes within your portfolio to try and maintain a good average return. Earlier I mentioned that it was simple for investment managers to capture return. And what this chart shows is that most of the time, the dominating color in the chart is green, showing that almost all asset classes, most of the time, were making money. What I expect will happen to this chart in 10 years' time is that we'll see a lot more variation in the returns, perhaps a bit more yellow and red across the table, and the numbers themselves in absolute terms will possibly be slightly lower as well. And I think what's going to be really important is just making sure that we have a high quality mix of asset classes in our portfolios that can really protect us across different market environments. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some portfolio management characteristics in the new investment landscape. The most important being that we are in a more challenging environment and achieving excess returns will be hard to do. And we expect investment managers will be really tested in these times. The last market cycle, with all the simple characteristics, saw the emergence in some cases of a slightly lazy approach to investment management, often referred to lazy or in some cases closet tracker style investment management, was able to do so just by buying the market in simple formats, which usually resulted in positive returns. I expect and actually hope that now we are in a more testing time, the managers who resorted to this approach will find it much harder to hide and will either be forced to upskill and provide a much more sophisticated solution or will have to leave the industry, ultimately resulting in a much better result for investors. Another key point with regards to portfolio management is really making use of alternative asset classes within portfolios. This will mean looking at the marketplace for opportunities to invest in which have a much lower correlation to your existing basket of goods, providing a potential cushion of protection if markets get volatile again, whilst also providing some exciting opportunities for the portfolio in areas perhaps which your mainstream asset classes might not have exposure to. Now, this could be in alternative asset classes, but also looking at the existing asset classes from a slightly different light, looking at different regions, different parts of the market to try and really find more exciting opportunities than what we've seen in the mainstream. With interest rates now higher than what we've been used to, fixed income is really playing a part within portfolio construction, and having a good high quality managers in place who can make use of the different fixed income securities within a portfolio will really start to make a difference. Having this intentional approach towards fixed income investing, I think, will be really important. So having a focus on an asset class which is recently has sort of almost been overlooked is going to play a much more crucial role in building returns for your portfolios. And just the last point here is an area which I think is overlooked is being cost conscious with your investment portfolios. Now, what I'm not saying is that we should all go and invest into the cheapest vehicles as possible. In fact, I'm definitely not suggesting this. I think given the new challenging investment environment that we're in, good active management will be really beneficial for investors. By cost conscious, I mean that you're getting good value out of your investment proposition. At the end of the day, cost is the only thing an investment manager is guaranteed. We don't know what the volatility is going to be like, and we don't know what the returns are going to be like. But making sure that we have a firm grasp on the cost of the total portfolio will really help towards capturing as much net return as possible. At Francis Clark, we're always speaking to our investment management partner firms, ensuring that our clients are continuing to have access to competitive pricing structures, ultimately making sure they can get as good value as possible. So for my last slide, I'm going to be talking a little bit about probably the most popular question I hear at the moment, and that is the debate of investing versus putting money into high interest rate saving accounts. I'm going to start off by saying that for some people, not investing into markets and simply putting money into an easy access account is probably the better thing to do. As I say, this might be because they're particularly risk averse or they need to access the capital within a really short time frame. But overall, we're glad to see better options for those who need it with that higher rate available. However, if we're talking about outright returns over the long term, the data in research and the forward-looking capital market assumptions, etc., all suggest that investing in equity markets still has the most positive outlook for returns over the long term. I'm going to finish on a slightly more positive note. There's a lot of me saying that it's going to be very hard to make returns over the next few years. But I think there is a lot to look forward to with markets, actually. Yes, I believe that markets are going to be more challenging than they have been 5 or 6 years ago. But I think there are some fantastic investment opportunities out there. We have the developments in East Asia, a massive upskilling of the population, new exciting businesses being born. We see great developments in the world of sustainability with the likes of carbon extraction technology, which all present great investment opportunities where where appropriate. And there's always new, exciting businesses seeking investment, which our managers continue to have access to. And having access to high quality, good investment managers will enable access to these opportunities and businesses. And whilst I don't think it's going to be an easy cycle, I certainly look forward to the coming years and seeing what we can offer for our clients. I hope you found that useful. A little overview on what we can possibly expect as change within the new world from a tax and investment perspective.
So thank you for your time, everybody. It's a pleasure to sort of present this afternoon. We have a disclaimer slide, which, yes, please do read that if you have trouble sleeping. So thank you all very much, and hopefully we'll see you at another one of these sessions soon.